Good evening, everybody. I've been mulling over this video for quite a while and circling around what I want to say about Russia and Ukraine, both in light of the situation now, terrible situation happening now, and in the context of the occult works we've been looking at from the schools of Miebs, Shmakov, Nina Rudnikova, and of course Valentin Tomberg. I've been trying to think what they would make of all this and what I make of it myself, because it's so complicated. I touched on it a little bit in, I think, my last one, or maybe last but one video, where I hinted at something to do with the Shin element and how I feel that this critical key arcanum of the Russian occult school is still being employed, because obviously we now in our rooms around the world are not the only ones who read occult works. There are people in much more powerful positions than us who do also, and it's inconceivable that they don't know even at least some of the things that we do. So that's been on my mind, and especially in the light of what we learned about Valentin Tomberg and the Dark Order which targeted him, as indeed targeted Rudolf Steiner, we shouldn't forget. I've been thinking about how those Dark Orders have evolved up into the present day, which brings us to a subject of such magnitude in every possible way that, well, I'm sure you can imagine why I'm to build up to it because it's not by any means straightforward to put in a nutshell what's happening now. I don't know if it's possible at all. It's more a case of trying to join some dots, I think, and as emeticists, people who care basically about what's happening and can see that wickedness in high places in a spiritual sense is dictating, governing what manifests in the world, might well wonder what to do, because if you're faced with, on the one hand, tremendous egregore, more than one egregore, communism and Nazism, still at work in the world today, fueled by the fervour of the masses. But on the other hand, the high occult knowledge of the kind I described in the video about the Dark Order targeting Tomberg, where I felt that they'd been subverting the principles set out by the Emesh River Dividus group, first started by Miebs and then taken into the Moscow Brain Institute. And when you think about that manifesto, you start to realise the awesomeness of the enemy and the extent of its machinations, stretching back over at least 100 years now, and beyond, but let's just stick with the past 100 years, that's quite long enough to deal with. And I try and think of some of the techniques they would be employing to achieve the goals spoken of. You may recall that the Russians, before and around the Bolshevik Revolution, the magicians working them in the MS group, and which may already have been going dark by then. Meaves had already been sent to a gulag. I'm sure they were all feeling desperate. They only felt that they'd got to the 4th stage out of 9, and a lot of them were arrested and prevented from leaving the country when they intended to continue with those stages from safer shores abroad. Of course, some of them did escape. But regardless of that, it seems to me that the terrible regime which took control of Russia during the Bolshevik period, starting with Lenin and then Stalin after him, the latter having been tutored by Gurdjieff, no less, and having trained as a priest, a man who certainly understood the principles of the occult, as did Lenin, an embalmed mason in his ziggurat, and occultism being so embedded in the Russian psyche. Somebody could declare themselves an atheist and still have a profound understanding of occultism that they'd be able to use for their own political purposes. What would those people have done in order to make their goals come true? And it seemed obvious that control of the Shin element would have been the enabler. And if we think back again to my video about the steps that I feel they have been able to achieve in more recent times, thanks to the convergence of science, peaks of science with magical processes and occultism, artificial intelligence and all that goes with it, the manipulations of energy, the elements, the weather, the human genome, have, I believe, enabled penetration, certainly of the mental, psychic domain of humanity. I've also got reason to think that the astral realm has been at least partly taken over, leading to, there's grey zones there anyway. Anyway, there's been a lot to think about there, and recently I read some very interesting articles by a Russian Orthodox priest now called Vladimir Moss, who's uploaded a series of really interesting articles onto Script, and I read a bunch of those, and it felt like he was going to the heart of all I'd been thinking of. And in fact, he what he said, being, a true Orthodox and a Russian himself with a great understanding of this period and of Russian history, he swayed my opinion of which side of the fence, I wanted to be on in all of this. Given that the Western world has also behaved atrociously over the years. So what I did was I thought I'd read some of this article from Vladimir Moss, together with a bit of a preface. And I'll see how far I get. I'm already almost 10 minutes in, so if it gets too long, I'll call a stop and have a part 2. But for now, I'm going to just begin. So here's what I've written. Some of these essays by Vladimir Moss, I believe, shed light on the Russian Revolution, the role played by freemasonry in the revolution, how Putin's goal has been to gain revenge on the West for the actions taken against Russia. Lenin as a strong contender for the title of Antichrist, which won't be a surprise perhaps to readers of Valentin Tomberg. So the title of Antichrist, maybe holy, not holy, but in part at least, because it's obviously debatable whether one person could be that figure. And how this taps into Valentin Tomberg's views of the revolutions, the French and Russian revolutions. He quite famously and definitely believed were great evil for mankind. And he says, Valentin Tomberg that is, in Meditations on the Tarot, for Plato illumines whilst Marx sweeps away. The Reformation, rationalism, the French Revolution, materialistic faith of the 19th century, the Bolshevik Revolution, show that everywhere mankind is turning away from the Virgin. The sources of creative spiritual elan are drying up, and an increasing aridity is showing up in all domains of the spiritual life of the West. Each revolution which has taken place in the West has advanced the process of ageing in the West, a further distancing from the principle of the Virgin. A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. It has grown in stature and in power. Engendered by the will of the masses, born from the despair following the Industrial Revolution in Europe, nourished by resentment accumulated through the generations, armed with a dummy intellectuality which is Hegel's dialectic misconstrued, this spectre has grown and continues to make the rounds in Europe and other continents. Today already 1/3 of mankind is impelled to bow down before this God and to obey it in everything. The French Revolution was an orgy of perverse collective intoxication, just as the revolution in Russia was. What I am saying here concerning the generation of the most imposing modern egregore is in perfect accord with Marxist teaching itself, because for Marxism there is no God or gods, there are only demons, in the sense of creations of the human will and imagination. This is the fundamental Marxist doctrine of the so-called ideological superstructure. So I was quoting there from various places in Meditations on the Tarot where he's talking about revolutions and communism and egregores. And what's particularly interesting, well, everything's interesting about Tomberg, but what's particularly interesting about that extract is he mentions the misunderstanding, deliberately or otherwise, of Hegel's dialectic, which, for readers of Anthony Sutton, the eminent economic historian, who was also censored for speaking too much truth, the skull and bones men of Yale University, aka masters of at least the American universe, they also misconstrued Hegel's dialectic, which they became enamoured of when they spent time in Berlin as part of kind of university exchange programmes, and they learned there that the friction of contending ideas is necessary in this philosophical system for progress and advancement, and they took the idea of friction and turned it into continual warfare and strife. Need I go on? No. Okay. So, Vladimir Moss. So that was Tomberg's thoughts on it. Vladimir Moss, just a few details on him, because he has got good credentials. He's the son of a British diplomat, born in London in 1949, educated at Charterhouse, Oxford University and Surrey University, with degrees in philosophy and psychology. Languages are French, Russian, Ancient Greek and Latin. And he has a special research interest in Orthodox Christian theology, history, Russia since the Revolution. He is an Orthodox Christian and since 1975 has been reader of the Orthodox parish of St Michael in Guildford, England, and is chairman of the Orthodox Foundation of St Michael in Guildford. On his website, which is called orthodoxchristianbooks.com. I'll leave a link below in the comments section. He states that he's been writing several books, and there's a 5th volume in progress called Christian Power in the Age of the Antichrist, i.e. 1914 to the present day. In this project, the original historical unity and gradual divergence of the Eastern and Western forms of Christianity are traced in considerable detail in order to bring out the truth of the Eastern Orthodox Christianity and its struggle for survival in the face of the onslaught from the West. Now, I'm going to now read out his essay. And we're going to stray from the outset into controversial areas. Okay? I've only just started reading Vladimir Moss's work in the past week or two. I haven't seen anti-Semitism in his work. I myself, anyway, you'll see what I mean, okay? It is a bit controversial. But what really interests me in what he's saying is his focus on the Masons, okay? So, here we go. And this is from his essay, The Cold War and Putin's Revenge. If the October Revolution was largely engineered by Bolshevik Jews, the February Revolution which preceded it and made it possible was engineered by Masonic Russians under the directions of the Grand Orient of Paris. The Bolsheviks were not in general Masons. After the Revolution, they suppressed Masonry in Russia, but they played the same role as the Illuminati in the French Revolution, that of ultimate victors. But the question arises, were any of the leading Bolsheviks also Masons? According to Subdeacon Konstantin, incomprehensible sounding name, formerly a Lieutenant General of the KGB, one of the leaders of the KGB intelligence, Colonel Lolly Zamoyski, was also a famous journalist and writer. He was studying Masons on his own, and once I invited him to read a lecture on them for us, less than 10 officers, members of Group A of Directorate T of the KGB First Directorate. Group A was a group of assistants to the head of scientific and technical intelligence, Major General Leonid Zaitsev. Zamoyski told us a lot of interesting things. In particular, he said that Lenin had left his signature in the visitors' book of one of the Masonic lounges in Switzerland, introducing himself as Brother Visitor. I.L. Solonovic sees the Masonic aristocracy as no less guilty of the revolution than the Jews. The whole of the 19th century was filled with the struggle of the autocracy against the aristocratic elite. In this struggle, both warring sides perished. However, the monarchy perished with some chance of resurrection, but the aristocracy with absolutely no chance. I'm speaking of the destruction of the aristocracy as a ruling class. Still quoting. The roots of this struggle, and the quote's quite long, I'll tell you when it's finished. The roots of this struggle go deep into the past, perhaps as far as Kalita and the Terrible One, but we shall not descend to the depths of the ages. We shall only recall that whilst the mystical beginning of the Russian Revolution is usually ascribed to the Decembrists, there were no Jews among them. Then there came Belinsky and Chernyshevsky and Bakunin and Herzen and Plekhanov and Lavrov and Milyukov and Lenin and many other sowers of the rational, the good and the eternal. In the course of a whole century they shook and undermined the building of Russian statehood. All this work was covered by the moral authority of Prince Peter Alexievich Kropotkin, who had not been bought by the Jews, and Count Leo Nikolaevich Tolstoy, who, although taking no bribes from the Jews, undermined both the state and the church and even the family very thoroughly. And any Berdichev chemist from the Bund or from the Bolsheviks in his struggle against the order created by history could have taken me by the lapel and said, "Listen, are you an intelligent person? Can't you see that I am walking in the steps of the best lights of Russian thought?" And what could I, as an intelligent person, reply to this chemist? Truly he was walking in their steps, and Chernyshevsky really was a light. If we, out of the whole of this extraordinarily complicated combination of factors that was making and supporting the revolution, concentrate our fire only on one, on Jewish people, then we have lost the plot. It's not so simple. They say the Jew Jacob Schiff gave money for the Russian Revolution. Yes, he did. But the old ritualist Sava Morozov also gave money for the same revolution. And Germany gave more than any. Not the Germany of Weimar and Ebert, and still less Hitler, but the Germany of the Hohenzollerns. It's no secret for anybody that all these entrenched truths were published on German money. Whilst in the Kaczynskaya Palace, German marks were valued above all. Sorry for my pronunciation of some of these words. But if you simplify the matter to such a degree that one can make a revolution in the world with money, then the October Revolution was made on German money. However, it was with the closest and most powerful participation of almost the whole of Russian Jewry, who of course had been subject to pogroms, serious pogroms, for a long time under the Tsars, so this is understandable, okay? That they would go against a regime that was openly persecuting them in a terrible way. Back to the quote. And so, the elite of the aristocracy laid the main weight of the struggle against the monarchy on their own shoulders. They were joined by the Raznochinsky, and by the very last decades of the past century, this anti-monarchist front received powerful support from the whole of Russian Jewry. End of quote. Father Lev Lebedev writes, soon after the manifesto of October 17th, 1905, which gave certain freedoms, legal Masonic lodges, which had before been banned, began to appear. And although, practically speaking, secret Masonry never ceased to exist in Russia, the absence of legal lodges was for the Masons a great obstacle. A reserve was being prepared in France by the Grand Orient. Already in the 60s, some Russians had entered French Masonry in Paris. The Mason Boris Telepnev wrote, the existence of Masonic lodges was discovered by the Russian government in 1909. It also became known to the authorities that they were of French origin. It was then decided by the Russian lodges to suspend work. This was done accordingly until 1911, when some of their members decided to renew their activities with due prudence. One would not call these activities Masonic in any sense, as their chief aim was purely political. The abolition of the autocracy and the democratic regime in Russia, they acknowledged pure political and the abolition of autocracy and a democratic regime in Russia. They acknowledged allegiance to the Grand Orient of France. This political organisation comprised about 40 lodges in 1913. If you remember, Mebes ended his association with Papists and the French lodges in 1912 because he obviously saw this coming and didn't want to be part of it. In 1915 to 1916, disagreements arose between their members who belonged to two political parties, the Constitutional Democrats and the Progressives, and could not agree on a common policy. 10 lodges became dormant. The remaining 30 lodges continued to work and took part in the organisation of the 1917 March Revolution and in the establishment of the provincial government. Their political aim being attained, the organisation began to decay. 28 lodges existed on the eve of the Bolshevik Revolution, and since then most of their members have left Russia. Lebedev continues. Besides lodges of the polar star structure, there also existed lodges of a mystical tendency. Amongst them were the Martinists, old style, headed by a great master, Count Musin Pushkin, which was joined by many from the aristocracy and even from the imperial family. Great Princes Nicholas Nikolaevich, Supreme Commander of the Russian Armed Forces in 1914-15, Peter Nikolaevich and George Mikhailovich. Among them, at one time, was a noted Mason and occultist Papus, who was very active. Papus even hoped to draw His Majesty Nicholas II, but was not successful. Among the mystics were the Masons Philaletes, who were joined by great Prince Alexander Mikhailovich, the brother of George, and a string of aristocrats, about 1,000 people in all. Their main occupation was a spiritist séances, supposed communion with the spirits and souls of the dead, which quite a lot of the intelligentsia were interested in at that time. Finally, there was a directly Satanist lodge, Lucifer, which included many from the creative sort, basically decadents such as Vyacheslav Ivanov, V. Bryusov, and A. I did look up his name, I can't remember it by now, Belistin, something like that. Not Belistin. On the direct orders of the Grand Orient of France, Masonry extended its tentacles into the state apparatus, into the diplomatic corps. Thus, according to the data of N. Verberova in her book People and Lodges, the Masons in the diplomatic service were K.D. Nabokov in England, A.D. Kandaurov in France, G.P. Zabello in Italy, A.V. Nekludov in Sweden, I.G. Loris Melikov in Norway, K.M. Onu in Switzerland, B.A. Bakhmatev in the USA, N.A. Kudashev in China, A.I. Sherbatsky in Brazil, etc. All the Masonic lodges in Russia were linked and communicated with each other and with foreign centres, first of all with the Grand Orient of France, and all of them together were ruled by a purely Jewish community called sometimes a lodge and sometimes called an order, B'nai B'rith, which was at the head of United World Zionism with its centre in the USA. I'm just going to say right now that I am not anti-Zionist. I'm actually quite pro-Zionist. I'm certainly pro-strong Israel. However, I do believe there is clearly a Masonic plot to govern the world, okay? Just to put myself and my opinions into this, for clarity. Telepnev also reported, by the way, this is in the notes to the article, that an independent lodge of the so-called Martinist Rite was formed among the entourage of Tsar Nicholas under the name of the Cross and the Star, which suspended its work in 1916. That, I'm not sure if that was one of Miebs's. It probably was, if it was around that time in St. Petersburg. Perhaps Great Prince Nicholas Mikhailovich Romanov, the chairman of the Russian History Society, was a member of this lodge. Okay. Other Martinist lodges, Apollonius, we've got Miebs in St. Petersburg, 1910, St. John in Moscow. That could have been linked to Shmakov, I'm not sure. I don't know all these lodges off by heart. And St. Andrew in Kiev. A very curious lodge existed among the Russian Navy League, calling themselves Philaletes. Beside philanthropic intellectual work, it pursued a political aim in opposition to that of the Grand Orient lodges, namely the support of the monarchy of Nicholas II. Probably this movement arose in connection with the Paris branch of the Swiss order of the Chevalier Philaletes, which established two lodges in St. Petersburg, the Pyramid of the North and the Star of the North. Both pursued studies of mysticism and symbolism. Okay. For the Western centres, we're back to Vladimir Moss now. And he's got a long quote here from this book, People and Lodges. For the Western centres, the most important thing from a political point of view was Russian political masonry of the polar star structure. In 1909, it declared that it was liquidating itself. This was a manoeuvre well known from the time of the Decembrist P. Pestel, whose aim on the one hand was to get rid of ballast and spies that had penetrated into its midst, and on the other hand to create a new secret union for the political struggle that would not be subject to the suspicion and danger its legal brothers were in. Thus, in the same year of 1909, a deeply conspiratorial military lodge was formed and headed by A.I. Guchkov, and in 1910 the Ursa Minor Lodge for work with state society, in which the main roles gradually came to be played by Prince G. Lvov, M.V. Rodzianko, A.F. Kerensky, N.V. Nekrasov, P.P. Ryabushinsky, M.I. Terashenko, and A. Konovalov. Over them, that is, over the whole of Russian masonry of this tendency, they weighed the Masonic oath of fidelity to the Grand Orient of France, which was given already in 1908 in the form of a special document called obligation. This oath obligation was kept faithfully both before and after the self-liquidation and the emergence of a new leadership and a new structure. In 1910, this leadership declared its formal independence from Russian masonry, but with the agreement of the French of the Grand Orient. The new leadership significantly simplified the reception of new members. It rejected for conspiratorial reasons many elements of Masonic symbolism and ritual, and thereby became, in the language of the Masons, unlawful. But all of this was part of the conspiracy, so that in the event of something, World Masonry could declare its complete non-involvement in the conspirators and the conspiracy. In actual fact, the whole course of the conspiracy was led and controlled precisely through foreign Masons, through the embassies of Germany, England and France in Russia. So of course it suited them to blame Jewish people, okay? In 1910, Guchkov, a long-time member of the State Council and the Third State Duma, became the president of the Duma. However, in 1911 he voluntarily resigned from this post, which was immediately taken by his brother Rodzianko. In 1913, Guchkov and other brothers created a secret Supreme Council of Peoples of Russia, which was joined by up to 400 members. But the presidents of the lodges knew only its secretaries, Nekrasov, Kerensky, and Tereshchenko. Each new lodge consisted of no more than 12 members. The council and its covenant coordinated the actions of the military lodge and the structures of Ursa Minor. At this time, Guchkov headed the military committee of the State Duma and was in charge of defence questions. In accordance with service obligations, he was linked with the general staff and the most prominent military men, diplomats and industrialists. Gradually, one by one, Guchkov attracted into his military lodge a whole series of generals. So this is a military Masonic lodge. In essence, in the years 1909 to 1913, Guchkov had already prepared a general plan of action, which he borrowed from the Young Turk Masons in 1908 in Turkey, where he went specially to study the experience of the Turkish Revolution. The essence of the plan consisted in the higher military officers, including those in the Tsar's closest entourage, being able at the necessary moment to isolate their monarch from all the levers of administration and force him to whatever deed or word the conspirators needed at that moment. As we can see, Masonry contained prominent activists and members of the leadership of almost all the parties and major organisations. Kerensky later recalled that in Masonry they almost never allowed themselves to violate the unity of the Brotherhood by party disagreements, but in public a sharp polemic between the parties went on, a struggle that sometimes seemed irreconcilable to the public, the profanes. So whatever party came to power in the event of the revolution, there would in any case be brother Masons at the helm of power. Still at the helm of power. Jona Sadova writes, this group of Masons, about 300 people, had absolutely no interest in the official aims of Masonry and rituals. They had their own clearly defined aim to gain political power in the Russian Empire. Their numbers were too small to effect a revolution on their own, but they were hoping that a coming great war would make their task easier. They would hope that a coming great war would make their task easier. This is over 100 years ago. Might they want a great war now to help make world domination easier? But this raised a problem. Would not nationalist rivalries between different national lodges endanger the enterprise? After all, as Oleg Platonov points out, all the main Masonic orders of the warring countries were in favour of a war. The Great National Lodge of England, the Grand Orient of France, the Grand Orient of the Nations of Russia, the Old Prussian Lodges, and the Great Lodge of Hamburg. The latter was the foundation of the Great Serbian Lodge, members of which were involved in the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand in Sarajevo. However, whatever their personal nationalism, the Masons of different countries were united in their desire to destroy the monarchy in its traditionally orthodox autocratic form, and, as we shall see, this overriding aim proved stronger than any national war aim in 1917. So you see, it really is all an Illuminati Masonic plot. The abdication of Tsar Nicholas II on March 2nd, 1917 marked the end of the Christian era of political history initiated by the coming to power of St. Constantine the Great in 306. This enormous change and the enormous loss was felt immediately by those who lived through it. As the novelist I.A. Bunin wrote, our children and grandchildren will not be able even to imagine that Russia in which we once, that is, yesterday lived, which we did not value and did not understand, all that might, complexity, wealth and happiness. So now I've seen that because Vladimir Moss has several essays that I read all together, I've put extracts from a few of them at the start of this as a kind of preface to the Putin section. I'm only 6 pages into 28, so I'm not going to read much more in this session, otherwise it'll be a really long video, but I will make a start on the proper section on the Cold War and Putin's revenge. On December the 25th, 1991, while the Americans were celebrating Western Christmas, the Soviet flag came down over the Kremlin, and the red, white and blue of Russia, which had also been Russia's pre-revolutionary flag, was raised in its stead. As the clock on the Kremlin's Soviet Tower struck midnight at the turn of the new year 1992, the famous chimes were drowned out by the sound of fireworks. Champagne flowed and people sang. Everyone believed they had a right now to what they'd begun to call a normal life. What they got, according to Catherine Merridale in her book Red Fortress, was hardship and uncertainty. The list of problems that the new republic faced would have challenged a far stronger and more deeply rooted regime. From environmental degradation and low productivity to the collapse of public infrastructures, the Soviet legacy was crippling enough on its own. But the new state's headlong economic reforms added further stress, precipitating high rates of mortality and record levels of crime, hyperinflation, and shortages of everything from food to anti-cancer drugs. The Russian Ministry of the Interior estimated that by 1993, 85% of the new private banks had links to organised crime. So did almost half the country's businesses, which was not surprising when even an honest trader could not survive without paying for protection and following underworld rules. The official murder rate in Moscow increased eightfold between 1989 and 1993, and the true figure was probably blacker still. Unsurprisingly, almost no one was prepared to gamble on the new republic's future prosperity. and the 1990s saw a massive hemorrhage of capital from Russia to safe havens such as London and New York. Since most of it was exported illegally, the figures are hard to establish, but estimates for the period 1990 to 95 vary between 65 and 406 billion US dollars. In his State of the Union address, President Bush referred to the implosion, this is from another book by Serhiy Plokov, The Lost Empire. President Bush referred to the implosion of the Soviet Union in a year that had seen changes of almost biblical proportions, declaring that by the grace of God, America won the Cold War, and announced the dawning of a new world order. A world once divided into two armed camps, Bush told the joint session of the US Senate and House of Representatives, now recognises one sole and preeminent power, the United States of America. The audience exploded into applause. And actually, if you, going back to Anthony Sutton, he's written more books other than the one on Skull and Bone Society. One is about how Wall Street funded the Bolshevik Revolution, and the other is about how Wall Street funded Hitler. So, just to put that in a bit of context. For the third time in 73 years, the United States bestrode the globe like a colossus. All three victories, those of 1918, 1945 and 1991, can plausibly be claimed to have been victories of American democracy over one or another species of totalitarianism. Debatable, very much debatable. But the difference, because they caused it, anyway, but the differences between them were important. In 1918, the proto-totalitarian state of Germany had been defeated, but it had been the Europeans who had borne the main brunt of the war, while Germany herself had been neither occupied nor purged of her totalitarian spirit, which went on to grow in fierceness under Hitler, necessitating a Second World War. Moreover, a new totalitarian empire, that of Soviet Russia, had been growing with equal speed and ferocity. The Hegelian dialect, remember? You need the friction to keep growing yourself, especially if the war is on somebody else's soil. In 1945, America's share in the final victory was much larger, and the demons of Nazi Germany and Imperial Japan were finally exorcised. But Germany's loss had been the Soviet Union's gain, and that empire was now at the height of its powers and more than ever dangerous, making the Cold War inevitable. The only alternative was a hot war, which thankfully was avoided. In that war, America's share in the victory was larger still. The other Western powers had contributed a much smaller share of the burden and, with the exception of Britain, were not always faithful to the Western alliance. Moreover, by 1991, of course, Churchill was very pro-American. By 1991, none of the old totalitarian powers was left standing, only China, which had nipped the democratic virus in the bud on Tiananmen Square, and it appeared as a possible future rival of the all-conquering American colossus. A resurgence of Russia was arrogantly discounted. As the lawmaker Konstantin Zachulin said, when the West thought the Cold War competition was over, they lost respect for their opponent. Now they are waking up to this again. And that was the end of the quote from Catherine Belton, Putin's People. But there were disturbing resemblances between 1918 and 1991. Once again, the defeated power had not been occupied, nor its totalitarian spirit exercised. As in 1918, so in 1991, the defeated power felt that it had been stabbed in the back, betrayed by foreign and domestic enemies, which it had. To make things worse, it was still a nuclear power. In December 1994, Russia, Ukraine, the United States and the United Kingdom signed the Budapest Memorandum, thereby guaranteeing the territorial integrity of Ukraine, Belarus and Kazakhstan in exchange for giving their nuclear weapons to Russia. This solved the problem of nuclear proliferation that so worried the Americans. But it gave Russia still more power to blackmail its neighbours. And as events in 2014 were to prove, Ukraine's territorial guarantees like Czechoslovakia's in 1938, were not worth the paper they were written on. Scott D. Sagan writes, in 1947, the American diplomat George Kennan outlined a strategy for the patient but firm and vigilant containment of the Soviet Union. He predicted that such a policy would eventually lead to either the breakup or the gradual mellowing of Soviet power. He was right. That was in Sagan's book, The Korean Missile Crisis. But was he really right? The Soviet Union mellowed in its later years in that it killed and tortured fewer people, at home if not abroad. But from the perspective of 2021, it is difficult to say that Sovietism has really disappeared. In fact, the evil spirit laid in it at its very foundation has not only not disappeared, but appears to have mutated into a new, but no less virulent power akin to fascism. Nor could it be otherwise, for evil spirits do not mellow, nor can they be contained indefinitely. If they are not to break out again, they must be exorcised. This is symbolised by the failure of repeated efforts to get the central idol of the Soviet Union, the mummified body of Lenin in its pagan mausoleum, removed. In fact, the body should be not only removed but destroyed. For as Dmitrius Kolesnichenko writes, to this day the image of Lenin has a mystical link with the devil, for the dragon gave him his power and his seat and great authority, as it says in Revelation 13.2. It is curious that the people's artist Shukin fell ill and died after performing the role of Lenin on the stage. Undoubtedly a demon entered into him because he shared the experiences of the image. It is not surprising that reception into the Octoberists, the pioneers, the Komsomol and the party, and marriages, conferences and other Soviet enterprises are unfailingly carried out in front of the idol of the leader and have a magical influence on the masses. These words were written 30 years ago, but today there are still many millions who worship Lenin, and the supposedly Christian government of Russia does nothing to stop it. And Putin he idolises Stalin, who could hardly be a worse person. But he was asked, there's a book, I reviewed a book called Collapse, the Decline of the Soviet Empire, and Putin was asked who he thought the greatest Russian leader was, and Stalin came out on top, along with one of the emperors, I don't remember which one. And thinking of Lenin's tomb and the Fatima prophecies about the reconsecration of Russia, it has long been my opinion, and I've said this before on videos, that you probably don't recall, but several years ago, maybe 10 years ago-ish, a couple of art students in Russia did a stunt where they sprinkled holy water on Lenin's tomb. They were promptly arrested, and I have no idea what happened to them. I will look that story up because it absolutely jumped out at me at the time as being an incredibly powerful, magical act, which sort of triggered this reconsecration in a very definite way. I certainly took that as a trigger, and so did the Russian authorities, because they jumped on these students from out of nowhere. Putin is very superstitious. More recently, within the past year, I read news of a shaman making his way, walking from Siberia to Moscow. I'm not exactly sure. I think was it going to exorcise Putin or do something like that? Now you can imagine if a shaman set out in England to exorcise Boris Johnson, it would just be tabloid news, and Boris would probably meet him and take him for a drink. In any other Western nation, it would just be, fun bit of news, but in Russia, no, Putin went out and arrested this guy. You know, these are not the actions of somebody who is a non-believer in the occult. Okay? But if we think back to the Shin element, and the crucial thing about Shin is, in order to wield that power, you need to control the hat of the fool. If you're going to have that hat, you be the one that put it on your own head, and don't let somebody put the fool's cap on you and take control of the volatile Shin. This is the danger with the Shin. You might be an expert at martial arts, but this Shin is chaos theory. There's martial art involved, but that's not the only thing. The rules are its own. And I think that the Russian president might have fallen foul of that, because his decline has got the signs of inverted magic on it. So I think this is a good place to stop here, but I will carry on because in another video, because this is a really interesting essay by Vladimir Moss, which I will leave a link to in the comments, and I would welcome any more comments on this as well. No offence to Masons. Many Masons in the outer circle are not involved in this type of machination at all. It's the pyramid, remember, the eyes at the top, and the rest are just, you know, extremely, you know, some lovely people I know who are Masons and involved, you know, interested in the subjects I'm interested in, and I meet them, and we're all in the same boat in many respects. Of course, Meebs was a Mason, so, you know, it's not that, but we just have to face facts sometime. Okay. About who's trying to take over the world. So, right, thank you for listening. More next time.